So we're down to the last couple of lectures here for this course, and we're going to finish up with Earth's climate system, so trying to understand how climate works in the first place, global atmospheric circulation. Then we'll move on to how geologists know what past climates on Earth were like, and then we'll finish up with climate change. So we already finished up weather, and weather is basically just what you get on a specific day. What is the temperature? What is the moisture conditions? And as we all know, weather can change within minutes or hours. So these are the conditions of the atmosphere over a short period of time. Now we're transitioning over to climate. So climate is what you expect. And this is how the atmosphere behaves over a longer period, usually decades. So this is what you would expect on a given day. So up here in Massachusetts, maybe in May, you would expect the temperature to be 55 to 60 degrees or so. But what you get on a given day, it could be 70 degrees. That would be the weather compared to the climate is what you expect it to be based on historical norms or historical patterns. So hypothetically, as an example, you could look at a 30-year average temperature, normal average temperature range for a specific location, and then depending on what day it is, it might plot either above or below the norm. So weather is what you get, climate is what you expect. When we look at climate, the globe is basically broken into climate zones. So we have all these different climate zones. We won't fully talk about what each of these climate zones is in here, but there are tropical montane, warm, temperate, moist, cool, temperate, moist, boreal, moist, polar, moist. So tropical dry, warm, temperate, dry. There's lots of different types of climate zones depending on where you are globally. And we'll bring this back to biomes at the end of this lecture as well. So let's talk about understanding climate. So climate is first driven by the fact that the sun hits the equator most directly. So we've already talked about this in multiple other lectures, but the sun hits the equator most directly. And if you are north or south of the equator, then temperature is going to decrease. So if we look at temperature, temperature decreases if you go north or south of the equator. So we've already established that. Less direct sunlight equals cooler temperatures, especially in the ocean. If we're looking at land, what I want to point out is that temperature range is much greater on land than the ocean. So you can have much hotter areas on land than you have in the ocean. And that goes back to our discussion of the latent heat. So the idea that it takes a lot of water, it takes a lot of energy to cause water to change phase. So the oceans don't really change temperature too much. Land heats up easier, so it has a greater temperature range. So what you're going to do for your first set of quiz questions here for this climate part 1 lecture is that you're going to look at these 3 maps. So you have a map of global precipitation. On the top left, you have a map of global air pressure with high and low pressure. And then you have a map of deserts on the bottom here. So your questions that you need to answer first, where do the highest precipitation rates occur around the globe? Your second question, compare precipitation, top left, and air pressure. What pressure, high or low, corresponds to high rainfall around the globe? And then third, what latitudes are deserts at? Are they associated with high or low pressure? All right, so feel free to pause and return when you're ready. In order to understand climate, we have to understand that Earth is rotating. So if Earth didn't rotate, this is basically a simple model of what air would do. And warm air would rise at the equator and then flow to the North or South Pole and then sink and become cold air. So if Earth didn't rotate, this is kind of a simple model of what global atmospheric circulation would look like, with warm air rising at the equator because the sun hits it most directly. If you have warm air rising, as we've already established, that would be a low pressure system that is less dense air, and that is a high rainfall type environment. So that warm air would rise, and then it's going to flow. Some of the air will flow to the north, some of it will flow to the south, but eventually it's going to cool off because it no longer has sun to heat it up, the sun's energy to heat it up. So it cools off, and it will sink back down either at the north or the south pole. So that would be under high pressure. High pressure is cold air. High pressure air is sinking air. It is dense air. and it's also associated with clear skies and low rainfall. So we know that Earth rotates, so we can't really ignore the fact that Earth rotates when we're trying to develop a model of atmospheric circulation and how winds move around the planet. So we know that Earth rotates, and we've already talked about the rotation in terms of creating ocean currents. So you might recall back from oceans, we talked about ocean gyres. Ocean gyres were the fact that ocean circulation rotates counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere, counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. And that's due to something called the Coriolis effect, which we discussed. Since we have the Coriolis effect, and we have ocean currents, and we have pressure differences, the way that air circulates around the globe is much more complex than a very simple model like the one that we have here on the left side, with warm air rising at the equator and cold air sinking at the north or south pole. So if we take that simple model and we add in the Coriolis effect, what's going to happen is that we can form these kind of things that are called jet streams. We have a subtropical one, which just means it's between 0 and 30 degrees north or south. So that's the red here on the slide. And then we can also have what's called a polar jet stream, which is usually between 60 degrees north and the North Pole, or 60 degrees south. 60 degrees south in the South Pole. Okay, so we have these jet streams, and some of that air is going to rise in certain locations. Some of that air is going to sink in other locations. So the point is that the model that we have here on the left is not complex enough to account for the rotation of Earth, and it makes things a little bit more tricky. So this is a very messy figure here on the right side, but this is basically a map of global atmospheric circulation, and it follows a pattern. And once you figure out the pattern, it becomes a little bit easier to kind of understand it and interpret it. So if you remember, for example, that the sun hits the equator most directly, the sun is a source of heat, hot air rises. So at the equator, warm air rises, some of it splits and goes north, some of it splits and goes south, but eventually it's going to sink back down because it cools down at a specific location. Where it tends to sink back down is at 30 degrees north here, or 30 degrees south, the Tropic of Capricorn. South of the Tropic of Capricorn. Once it sinks down, because it's colder and under higher pressure, then some of it is going to flow to the north, some of it will flow to the south, and then once it gets to 60 degrees north, some of it is going to rise up into the atmosphere again because it's heated up. Heated air is rising air. So it will rise up into the atmosphere, some of it will flow to the north, and then sink back down at 90 degrees north. So what I've gone through is basically a complex model of what we call convection cells of air circulation. They're named by their location. So this one's called a Hadley cell between 0 and 30 degrees north. We have a Ferrel cell, and then a polar cell is up by the North Pole or the South Pole. The takeaways from this is that anywhere where you have rising air, where these arrows are going up away from Earth at the equator, and then again here at 60 degrees north, that's where you get rainfall. That's where you get clouds that will form. That's where you get forests, tropical forests, temperate forests. And that's where you get rising air, rising low pressure air. On the alternative, wherever you have sinking air with arrows pointing down back towards Earth's surface, so that would be here at 30 degrees north or south, and then 90 degrees north or south, that's where you have cold, dry, high pressure, dense, sinking air that sinks back down to the surface and creates desert-like environments at 30 and 90 degrees north or south. So if you put all that kind of on a diagram here, we have the equator. Rising air at the equator forms clouds. You get rainforests, you get tropical forests. Some of that air flows north, some of that air flows south. Wherever you have sinking air, cold, sinking, dry air, you get deserts. Where you have air rising again at 60 degrees north or south, you get clouds that will form in that location. So you get rain, clouds, low pressure air, rising air. And then lastly, at the North Pole or the South Pole, you get sinking air. Again, dry, cold, desert-like conditions. So just to show it another way, if this is easier for you to interpret, so we have kind of a cross-section between the equator, 30 degrees north, 60 degrees north, and the North Pole. What you should notice is that at the equator, at 60 degrees north, you have rising air that has rain associated with it. And then at 30 degrees north and the North Pole, you have sinking air coming back down to Earth's surface. So you don't have clouds, you don't have rain. You tend to have more desert-like conditions. So based on that, you have a map here that shows locations 2 and 1. So question 4 on your quiz, I want you to predict which location has the highest average annual precipitation of 524 inches or 1,300 centimeters per year. And then question 5, predict which location has the lowest average annual precipitation of about 0.03 inches or 0.08 centimeters per year. So we put all that together, which I realize that's a bunch of kind of circulation patterns and looking at different things going on. The takeaways here are that if you're at 0 degrees of latitude, if you're at the equator, you get rainforests because of rising air that's warm and moist. If you're at 30 degrees north or south, you have sinking air that's coming back down to the surface that's under high pressure. So dry air produces little rain, and you will get a hot desert at that latitude. 60 degrees north, you got rising air again. So rising air creates clouds, it creates moisture, and you get temperate forests like this one. And then 90 degrees north, you got sinking air again. So very cold sinking air gives you another desert-like condition. So when we're talking about climate regions and we put all of that together, we can classify climate into something called the Köppen-Geiger classification system. This is based on monthly temperatures and precipitation. We can kind of group everywhere across the globe into if it's like a cool temperate environment, if it's a polar environment, if it's dry, if it's warm temperate like here in Massachusetts, if it's a highland-like environment with tall mountains, or I don't know which one I skipped, or tropical, if it's a tropical environment. In terms of how that's done to create the map on the prior slide, these are given letters. So A is tropical, B is dry, C is warm temperate, D is cool temperate, E is polar, H is highland. But basically you have to read through the characteristics and then you can see based on moisture and temperature what type of environment a region might fall into in this Köppen-Geiger classification system. So why I bring this up is that you have some data here that you're going to look at. So this is data from Sydney, Australia between 1858 and 2002. So you have month of the year on your x-axis. On your left y-axis, you have temperature in degrees Celsius. And on your right y-axis, you have rainfall in millimeters. So rainfall is the box, the bars here, the boxes here. That's rainfall. And then green is the max temperature. And then blue is the minimum temperature by month. So based on that, you need to use the Köppen-Geiger table up here. You need to use this figure, and you're going to estimate the average monthly temperature as halfway between the mean high and mean low temperature. And then on the basis of this data, use the Köppen-Geiger system to determine what climate region Sydney, Australia belongs to. All right, if you would like to watch a summary video about this, here's a link to a summary video on YouTube for this particular atmospheric circulation that I was just talking about. And then to finish up and put it all together, this is where the biosphere comes from. So we have this map of biomes, which are just similar ecosystems containing similar plants and animals. And most of that comes from the fact that we have a certain type of global atmospheric circulation, and we can link that together with climate regions like the Köppen-Geiger climate systems we were just looking at. And that's where these maps of biomes come from, looking at like tundra, taiga, or taiga, depending on how you say it, temperate deciduous, rainforest, temperate grassland, deserts, all of that. That's where this comes from. All right. So that's it for this lecture here, and then we'll have 2 more. So the next one is going to be on how do geologists determine past climates, and then the final one would be on climate change.